turn around and head for the door, a taut silence clamped down on the railroad office. The lamp on the rough-hewn table flickered, sending misshapen shadows streaking up and down the wall. Morgan considered his chances here and found them poor. Uncertainty drew Jim Brown's brows into a heavy frown. Cold fury was in Darwin's eyes as they bored relentlessly into Morgan. There was no mercy in the chief engineer. No compromise in the way the gun was gripped tightly in his fist. Morgan felt the man's hostility build up around him like an invisible wall. It tugged heavily at his heart, like a heavy weight. From the street came the roars of the railroad men. There was no escape for him there. True, several hundred workers had seen Morgan's fight with Tracy and his partners and could vouch for his loyalty to Wyoming and Western. But for every Patty that had seen the fight, there were 5 who had only heard of it secondhand, or had not heard of it at all. When these men learned about Banyan, learned that Morgan was an imposter, all they would remember would be the wreck in Solo Canyon, their friends who had perished in the landslide. And in Morgan, they would find someone on whom they could unleash their mass fury. A wrong word, a shout for revenge, and the crowd would finish him. These were Morgan's dismal thoughts. All the future he could see were a few precious moments. When those had gone, death would be waiting for him. "Start moving," grated Darwin, waggling his gun. Grim lines bracketed Morgan's mouth. He realized disaster was near when Darwin began crowding him into a corner. But it was in a moment such as this that Morgan's full courage and resourcefulness were released. And he was a man who would resist to the last breath, would never back down, no matter how staggering the odds. He took off his hat, rubbed a muscular arm across his brow. "You're pushing me kinda hard," he observed, fumbling with the hat brim as Darwin took a threatening step toward him. Suddenly, Morgan threw the hat. It struck Darwin in the face. At the same instant, the gun exploded. The twisting brim struck the barrel, slanted the shot upward. The bullet drove over Morgan's head, and Darwin never had a chance to fire again. One great bound carried Wayne Morgan to Darwin. With lowered head and outflung arms, he came at the engineer. He butted Darwin under the chin, struck him with a looping right. Then, his big hands fastened on Darwin, lifted him up, and flung him against Brown. Their bodies collided. Brown threshed wildly about to retain his balance, but Darwin's weight pulled him backward. They hit the edge of the table, carried it with them to the floor. Morgan whirled, scooped up one of his guns, and raced through the doorway. He went down the shaky outside steps, 3 at a time. He struck the bottom as Darwin appeared on the upper level, shouting at the top of his lungs and firing. The street was swarming with men. Attracted by Darwin's yells, they swung about, came on in a muttering wave. They threatened to block the head of the alley. In desperation, Morgan swung back through the darkness. Behind him, Darwin kept yelling and shooting. "Get Wayne Morgan, you section hands, he's a killer!" The crowd came on, rushing into the passageway in clumsy, lumbering confusion. Men fell and were trampled by their comrades in the headlong race after a man they could not even see in the thick shadows. At the end of the alley, Morgan turned toward the depot. He had plunged on for 2 blocks when a horseman rode out of the gloom from between 2 buildings. "Who's that?" came the taut query as the rider drew rein. Morgan swerved, angling directly toward the man, with the sound of pursuit behind him, like the beat of angry surf on a lonely beach. The rider jerked his horse about, his hand speeding toward a holstered gun. The horse buck-jumped toward Morgan. Morgan stepped aside, threw himself against the animal's side. He flung a long arm upward, trapped the rider's left wrist, and hauled him out of the saddle. There was no time for gentleness. The man struck the ground with a jolting thud, started to scramble to his feet. Morgan drew his gun, chopped down with the barrel. As the man collapsed, he vaulted into saddle and galloped toward the depot. A scatter of shots ripped out behind him, but the lead went wild. As he reached the last houses of Silverbow and galloped across the tracks, the headlight of a switch engine towing a string of steel cars picked him out. Morgan kicked the horse into a run, darted past the train, and plunged on into the darkness. He kept going up a steady grade that carried him into timber half a mile from town. A few mounted men stormed out of Silverbow, speeding across the railroad yards, spreading out toward the hills. But none came in Wayne Morgan's direction. Pulling up in a grove of trees, he watched the small army of spikers, graders, and track layers pour into the yards and through the depot, searching for him. But after 15 minutes, the fever of the chase subsided, and they began to straggle back to the saloons. Morgan grinned, though there was no humor in being on the dodge. He thought of Blue Hawk then, swung the horse about, and struck off through the thinning timber, angling for a trail that would take him to their hideout. When he did not find the Yaqui there, he concluded that Blue Hawk must have landed a job with the Flying G. Turning his commandeered horse loose to find its way home, he saddled up the Hammerhead roan and rode off towards the Flying G. Before long, he drew to a halt in some brush behind the bunkhouse. The main house was shrouded in darkness, but there was a light in the bunkhouse. Morgan dismounted and gave the call of a mountain lion, a signal he and Blue Hawk used to summon each other. After a 10-minute wait, a shape emerged from the yard shadows and came toward the trees. "Senor?" "Yeah, Hawk. Come ahead." The Yaqui approached silently and swiftly. "I ran into some trouble tonight," Morgan told him. "I had to clear out." Briefly, he explained what had occurred. "Don't know how I'll stand with Brown and the Paddies, even after they hear what happened at end of track between Tracy and me. I'm still pretty much in the dark about the man behind the trouble. But I'm sure Brader has his irons somewhere in the fire. I mean to watch him. How about you, Hawk? What's new?" "Graham has been moving all his cattle into the lower meadows in the event a blizzard hits the country. He's putting heavy guards around them, too." "Let me know if he plans any move against the railroad," Morgan said, "though I've a feeling that Wayne Morgan has outlived his usefulness. From now on, the masked rider will have to take over." Lingering only long enough for Blue Hawk to sneak off to the kitchen and bring him some dried jerky and stale biscuits, Wayne Morgan remounted and rode off. Wayne Morgan, all next day, kept to the stiff edges of the hills, which overlooked the yellow-brown slash in the earth, which was the railroad's right-of-way. With the steel pushing farther and farther from Silverbow, most of the buildings there were being moved to the new town of Beaver Wells. For more than an hour in the early afternoon, Morgan looked down on Silverbow from a brush-covered ridge. He heard the dim beat of saw and axe and hammer, the far-off crash of building walls collapsing. Tents were stripped down and loaded into high-wheeled freighters, along with barrels, counters, store, and saloon fixtures. When he moved up the line, he saw Callahan's eager track crew throw steel across the new trestle, then attack the gentle grade on the opposite side of Harlow Creek, swarming swiftly toward Beaver Wells. Darkness brought Morgan back to Silverbow. He was impatient to be getting to the bottom of the problem that was nagging him. But for some reason, he could not explain why that same feeling of uneasiness assailed him persistently. He considered the string of accidents which had befallen Wyoming and Western, and he was well assured that whoever sought the railroad's destruction would not stop now. Other, and even worse trouble, could be expected. And that trouble might take any shape or form. It was this restlessness, this insistent sense of things going wrong, which sent Morgan into a patch of brush near the outskirts of town. He left the Hammerhead Roan in an empty barn, whose weather-worn lumber had no doubt been considered too far gone for salvage purposes, a building which was too ramshackle for ordinary use. Then, with a 2 days' growth of beard concealing his somber bronze face, and with his hat pulled low over his eyes, he mingled with the crowd. Only half the usual mob of construction workers roamed the streets. Many of them already had trekked on to Beaver Wells, where, Morgan guessed, new saloons were attracting trade. Walking along the wind-driven street, where ruts were from 4 to 6 inches deep, Morgan was thinking that in just a little while now, this boom town would be nothing but a bare, burned-out spot in the wilderness. Only a few rubbish heaps, an occasional tent stake or ramshackle barn would be left to show that there had ever been a town here. Already there were great dark gaps where canvas and wooden shacks had stood. Yet so far, Silver Bow still held tenaciously to its claim for existence. The Empire still drew hundreds of paddies to its bar and gaming tables. Inside, the band set up a noisy racket, and the 3-card Monte dealer could be heard calling for bets. Morgan walked past the wide V opening of the saloon, was momentarily caught in the bright flare of yellow light gushing out into the darkness. He saw a vivid swirl of color on the dance floor where percentage girls danced with grinning, bearded men. He was about to enter another honky-tonk several doors away when the sight of 5 men pushing through the torn flaps of the tent saloon halted him in the middle of the street. A wide-shouldered spiker, striding along with his head down, hands thrust deeply in his pockets, crashed into Morgan and swore savagely. Morgan didn't even notice the collision or hear the man's angry cursing. He was staring through narrowed eyes at Bill Tracy, who led the 4-gun-hung men. There was purpose in their manner, a wary watchfulness in their eyes. Morgan's right hand dropped nearer his belt. He moved on slowly, primed for a break as he saw the men look toward him. But their scrutiny was too swift for recognition. Morgan saw that Tracy's face was battered and bruised, and his nose was covered with a huge bandage. The 5 men swung down an alley. Some warning instinct sent Morgan stalking after them. He followed them to another alley which ran alongside the Empire. He dropped flat in the dirt when they paused at the head of the alley to scan their back trail. When they had ducked out of sight, he rose and ran lightly forward, loosening both guns. Chapter 10. Night Raid. There was no sign of Morgan's quarry when he turned into the alley. He paced cautiously through the gloom, the pupils of his eyes dilating as he peered through the shadows. When he saw the door on the side of the building, he realized it must lead directly to Jess Brader's private office. Here was an ideal means for Brader to contact his special friends without his regular saloon trade knowing anything about it. Grimly, Morgan slid up to the door, laid his ear against the panel. He could hear the subdued murmur of voices, but could not distinguish words. He stayed there until his body was stiff and his legs cramped. At last, he heard the scrape of chairs, the thud of boots coming toward the passage. Flattening himself against the building wall, he waited for the men to emerge. There was no time to run to the end of the alley, so if he were forced to shoot it out with 5 men, there was no help for it. What worried him most was that if he had to die tonight, he would never get to the bottom of the railroad's trouble. The door opened. Pale light flushed the alley and was shut off when the door closed with a squeak of unoiled hinges. All 5 men were there, and they stood in complete darkness. One was near enough for Morgan to touch, but he had his back to Morgan. Finally, as they moved off toward the street, Morgan heard one man mutter with gloating satisfaction, "If this works tonight, the railroad sure will be in a jam." "You'd better not miss," another man growled. "You take care of your end, and we'll handle Graham." Dismay clutched at Morgan's heart as he moved forward silently. He saw men separate at the end of the alley. 3 moved down toward the depot. What evil mission were they bent upon now? For a moment, uncertainty held him unmoving. He didn't know just what steps to take first, but what he did know was that he had to do this job alone, had to decide which group must be followed. Finally, he chose to follow Tracy, who had mentioned he was going to handle Ed Graham. It sounded as if the Colorado Central gunmen troubleshooters planned a raid on the Flying G. On Graham's beef herds, undoubtedly. Morgan saw Tracy and the man with him head for a livery to get horses, and he hurried through the crowd to where he had left the roan. He mounted, struck off beside a string of loaded material cars waiting for an engine, and picked up Tracy and his companion several hundred yards ahead of him on the main trail that led to the Flying G. Whatever Tracy's plan was, Morgan was certain the Colorado Central man would not stage a raid with just one aide, and his conjecture proved correct when a hail came out of the brush ahead of Tracy. Tracy answered, and 24 mounted men, all masked, swung into view. Dark as the night was, there were enough stars in the sky for Morgan's discerning eyes to see, by their faint glow, that most of these new riders sat their saddles awkwardly. They were all bulky men, and their indistinct voices were rough. Morgan guessed that they were railroad workers, either recruited from disgruntled members of Wyoming and Western or brought from Colorado Central's track gangs. "All set, Tracy?" one of the riders asked. "Yeah, Graham's got a big herd of cattle strung out in one of his lower meadows. Got about a half-dozen gun guards there. It'll be easy running off that beef. Let's go." The men whirled their mounts and stormed off up the trail. Morgan followed for a half-mile, then cut off into a side trail through thick timber. Once out of earshot of the other riders, he pushed the roan hard. He had come to a swift, hard decision. It was too far and too late to ride to Flying G headquarters. Besides, from what Blue Hawk had told him, Graham and most of his crew would be up in the Yellow Ridges hazing more strays out of the breaks. All Morgan could do was to stop off at the hideout, which lay in direct line with a shortcut route to the meadow, and change to his masked rider regalia. When he reached the camp, it was deserted. He quickly donned his mask, cloak and hat, and saddled Midnight. Then, with the powerful black stallion beneath him and eager for a run, he sped off through the night. He rode like a grim, evening figure of doom. His eyes were bright with the savage anticipation of battle, and his blood was fired as always when he rode for justice. Those 6 gun guards would be no match for the 24 raiders who were due to attack them, and his own 2 guns might do little to even the odds. Yet nothing could have induced him to swerve from his course. Fast as his ride was, he was still 2 miles from the holding grounds when the flat report of gunfire reached him. Dimly, he heard the bawling of cattle amid sporadic volleys of gunfire. The masked rider ducked lower over Midnight's magnificent, straining body. His face felt raw and cold, and the sky was being blotted out by heavy clouds which presaged snow. Then abruptly he was in the clearing, and the dark, heaving bodies of cattle, hoofs pounding the earth in a horrible drum roll of sound, horns clacking against horns, were rushing across the flats. Gunfire bloomed all around him. He saw the flash of 5 guns over in one corner of the meadow where the cattle had been bedded down, and knew that was where the flying G-punchers had taken their stand. One man was already down. Others would succumb when the raiders rushed them. One swift glance showed the masked rider there was no hope of saving the cattle. Already the raiders had detailed 6 men to string out along the flanks of the cows to hold them to some sort of uneven, wavering line. The rest of the raiders gathered in a tight knot. Then a man yelled, and the masked rider recognized the shrill, vindictive voice of Bill Tracy. The raiders plunged their mounts down the slope, straight toward the shallow gully where the flying G-punchers had taken refuge. At 100 yards, they opened up with 6 guns that filled the glade with a deafening thunder. They had no warning of the approach of that coal-black stallion and his masked, grim-faced rider until he was almost on top of them. Then the rider nearest to the black-clad man saw that great dark shape looming toward him and lifted a high, frightened yell into the night. "The masked rider! Look out!" The words died in his throat. Twin scarlet splashes leaped from the masked rider's gun bores. They speared the outlaw, jerked him out of the saddle, flung him under the flailing hoofs of another horse crowding close behind him. The masked rider came on relentlessly, his guns singing their songs of death. He emptied 2 more saddles with the deadly accuracy of his fire. So savage and reckless was his charge that he broke up the outlaw attack. The raiders split, circled about aimlessly, firing into the night. Then 3 men converged upon him, their guns bucking and roaring. The masked rider spurred Midnight straight at them. He caught the vague white blur of a face in his sights, dropped hammer on a shot. Now there were only 2 men left to face him. Bullets were droning about him. Something fiery slid along the top of his left shoulder, temporarily numbing his left arm. It forced him to holster his left-hand gun. The flying G-punchers were swarming up out of the arroyo, firing at the milling raiders. The night was suddenly a bedlam. A bulky shape rode toward him. The masked rider swung that way, and at the final instant recognized Blue Hawk. "Señor," cried the Yaqui, "you have come in time." With the words, the Indian's Winchester roared. A raider who had been drawing a bead on the masked rider's back flung up his hands and pitched backward over his cantle. On either side of the masked rider and Blue Hawk men were yelling and shouting and dying. A riderless horse, stirrups flapping, bucked wildly past them. Then 4 horsemen rushed up out of the gloom, closing in on the black-clad man and the Indian. Muzzle flame licked hungrily toward the masked rider. He felt the hot breath of a bullet going past his face. A horse crashed into Midnight, nearly unseating the masked rider. A swinging arm reached out of the darkness. A gun butt grazed the side of his head. Dizziness assailed him, and blackness veiled his eyes. But instinct and determination kept him going. He jerked Midnight to one side. His own gun came down in a savage arc, the steel barrel cracking against flesh and bone. One of the riders dropped. Swinging the gun barrel around in a blur of speed, The masked rider squeezed off a point-blank shot. He felt the gun kick back against his wrist, saw the ruby wink of flame, heard the shrill death shriek of a raider. Then he was turning, seeing Blue Hawk club an outlaw out of the saddle with the butt of his rifle. Another rider came against him, and the Yaqui lost his rifle. The Indian's hand streaked to the sash at his waist. There was a flash of steel as a knife blade sank hilt deep in the raider's chest. Suddenly, then, the masked rider and Blue Hawk were free and charging toward another knot of attackers. His body jolting to the lunging stride of the stallion, the masked rider felt the strengthening lash of the wind, saw the night sky turn white with drifting snow. Flakes as big as quarters floated down in a thick smother, swiftly blanketing the meadow in a white mantle. The rataplan of hooves, followed by a ringing shout, swung the masked rider's attention to the north. "Feed them raiders lead, you flying G-Waddies. Help is on the way." At the same moment that the masked rider identified that voice, Bill Tracy boomed a call through the night. "Hey, Jim Brown, Graham's bringing more men. We've got to hightail." Abruptly, the raiders went galloping toward the V-notch of a high-walled pass through which the flying G cattle had been driven. There was an exultant shout from the 3 surviving flying G-Waddies, still able to sit their saddles as Ed Graham stormed up at the head of 8 punchers, whose guns were blasting a ruddy path through the pall of snow. All these men were dark, whirling specks in a heaving sea of white. There was a cutting edge to the wind. It howled in from the higher chimneys and peaks, whipped a stinging spray of flakes against unprotected faces. They charged on recklessly, strung out in a wide line, thundering after the fleeing raiders. A big gap separated the 2 factions, but the flying G-men were slowly reducing the distance. In the lead rode the masked rider. Few horses could challenge Midnight when it came to a matter of speed or stamina, and now the gallant black stallion showed his heels to the other mounts. Once the fleecy white curtain lifted enough for the masked rider to line his sights on a bobbing black shape. He let go with a shot, saw a horseman sway in saddle, then fall forward across the horn. Then the snow closed in again, whirling in a thick wall before the ripping gale. A gust of wind brushed aside the sweeping snow once more. In that brief interval, the masked rider saw the last of the raiders gallop into the V-notch of the pass. Then he saw something else, something that made him haul in on Midnight's reins. Ruddy, trailing flames flickered in the alternate rushes of white and darkness, lingering oddly in their slow descent to the ground. He heard no bullets, no crash of guns, and instantly recognized the danger with which he and the flying G-riders were plunging. "Back, all of you! Dynamite!" Chapter 11. Fighting the blizzard, Ed Graham halted his big gelding beside Midnight, for the moment not even noticing its rider. "Blast their souls," the cowman growled. "They've blocked up the pass." He pushed his horse forward cautiously, the masked rider at his side. The thump and roar of rocks had ceased, and the screaming wall of the wind drowned out all other sounds. Icy flakes pelted the masked rider's face. They plastered Graham's heavy brows and eyelashes. When they halted their horses, 10 feet in front of them, a wall of freshly riven rock and shale barricaded the entrance to the canyon. "Goodbye, cattle," mourned the bow-legged Harker. "It'll take 2 days to clear out that rubble." Ed Graham was cursing violently as anger shook his enormous body. "With the canyon blocked," he said grimly, "we'd have to make an 8-mile circle to get back to the trail. And this blasted snow will blot out any sign the raiders might leave." His voice lifted suddenly as he saw the black-clad man beside him, and his hand slapped to his holstered gun. "Where did you come from?" he demanded. "You're the masked rider, ain't you?" "He is the masked rider, Senor Graham," Blue Hawk shouted above the shrieking wind. "And if he hadn't arrived when he did, all the other gun guards would have been wiped out. I saw him ride straight for the raiders as they prepared to slaughter us in the arroyo. He broke up their attack almost single-handed." Graham grunted. The loss of his cattle was a terrible blow to his pride and his pocketbook, and he wasn't taking it easily. "How about that, Harker?" He whipped at the bow-legged man. "The Indian's telling it straight," declared Harker. "This masked rider is a wizard with guns. Couple times, I thought he was going to be salivated, but he came through with spouting guns and emptied more saddles." Graham sat stiffly in his saddle. He acknowledged his appreciation of the masked rider's daring, but avoided the masked man's keen glance. "How many had lost?" he asked Harker. "There were 200 in the bunch, and they're all gone." "That'll cripple me," Graham exclaimed. "Most of them were good-blooded stock, too. I can thank the railroad for that." "You're wrong, Graham," broke in the masked rider. Graham's features tightened. The skin around his cheekbones grew rigid. He blinked angrily through snow-lashed eyes. "Like blazes I am," he snapped. "I heard somebody yell Jim Brown's name as I was riding up with the rest of the crew. And Brown is Wyoming and Western." "I heard it too," admitted the black-clad man, in a firm, unyielding tone. "That was Bill Tracy, and I'm willing to bet that Jim Brown was in Silverbow all during this raid. Tracy yelled his name, wanting you to think the railroad was behind the attack." "Listen to me, masked rider," snapped Graham. "I'm plumb grateful for your help, but my beef is gone, and nobody'll ever convince me that Wyoming and Western wasn't back of all this. There's been lots of talk about financial difficulties. The stockholders are howling about waste. Maybe the railroad figures on smashing me and the other ranchers in the hills and gobbling up all the land so's they can make a fortune by cutting it up in sections and selling to the settlers who'll be following the steel. At the same time, it'd be a quick and cheap way of getting beef to feed the construction gangs." The masked rider shook his head and briefly told of what he had witnessed in Silverbow. "So it wasn't the railroad," he concluded. "It was Jess Brader and Tracy's bunch." "Maybe Brader lent Brown some men to handle the raid tonight," growled Graham. "But until I find other proof, I'm believing what I've seen and heard." He turned away, spoke to the crew. "Let's drift back. We got work to do, getting the wounded back to headquarters before the blizzard buries the bodies in 10-foot drifts." Slowly, they swung their horses in snow that was already an inch deep and piling up steadily under the unceasing lash of the storm. They came back to the meadow and turned page. "You're sure in line for shaving joy. When you use thin Gillettes, my boy. These blades last long. 4 cost a dime. You look well-groomed, save dough and time. Produced by the maker of the famous Gillette." Blue Blade dismounted. Graham's first move was to go to 3 of the dead raiders and rip the mask off their faces. "There you are, masked rider," he grunted savagely, pointing to 2 of the men. "Them gents are Gandy dancers. I've seen 'em in town." The masked rider's lips grew grim, and his eyes glowed vengeful fire as he, too, recognized the men. All 3 of them had been at End of Track the day he had beaten up Tracy. And all 3 had been among the disgruntled half-score of workers who had quit and gone back on the empty material train with Tracy. But the masked rider could not reveal this information directly, for it would establish a connection between Wayne Morgan and himself. Still, he gave the best possible explanation under the circumstances. They're probably part of the bunch that quit Callahan's track gang when the new troubleshooter beat up Bill Tracy for trying to make the crew strike. He broke off abruptly. Let's forget it and attend to the work waiting for us here. I don't need your help, Graham said gruffly. Don't be a fool. You can use every hand now. I was up in the Yellow Ridges this morning. Saw your punchers hazing cows out of the breaks. You'll have to drive the critters down to your ranch before this blizzard traps them. Reckon you're right at that, said the cowman. If this blizzard keeps up for a day, it'll block all the high passes. The Masked Rider, Blue Hawk, and the other Flying G punchers pitched in then, making temporary repairs on the wounded waddies. Of the 5 who had been with Blue Hawk originally, 2 were dead. The others were wounded, but able to ride. Although the raiders deserved to be allowed to lie where they had fallen, the unwritten code of the land dictated that their bodies be rolled into a deep culvert and covered with rocks. 2 wounded raiders were tied to their horses. Then, the party set off through the whirling storm, headed for Flying G headquarters. It was a long hour's ride through a night that had turned to a howling fury. Saddle leather squealed and creaked, and the face of every man was plastered with snow, bitten raw by the lashing wind. They rode with heads bowed under trees, straining under a weight of soft, clinging flakes that showered down upon them with each gust of wind. They were stiff with cold and barely able to move when they reached the main buildings and piled down. Graham routed the cook out of bed. A huge pot of coffee was placed on the stove and a hot meal put out. The coffee, liberally laced with whiskey, warmed the men, stirred their blood to circulating normally. The wounded men were put to bed in the main house, their bullet hurts washed and bandaged. The Masked Rider wanted to ride off to Silverbow for a doctor, but Graham prevailed upon him to stay and get a little sleep. The wounded were resting comfortably, and none of the men were in danger of passing out. Besides, there was a distinct risk in traveling that country alone at night in the midst of a blizzard. The Masked Rider discovered his own wound was nothing more than a shallow groove across his shoulder, which did not even warrant bandaging after it had been cleansed. Shortly after dawn, Ed Graham rounded up his crew and prepared to ride to the Yellow Ridges to help his hazers drive the cattle down from the hills before the blizzard trapped them in the mountains. Blue Hawk was detailed to go along, but the Masked Rider found time to instruct the Yaqui to contact him at once if Graham planned any move against Wyoming and Western. A threat of constant worry trailed through the Masked Rider's mind. He could not easily forget the scene in Silverbow the night before, when he had made his choice of which group of toughs to follow. And now he wondered what deviltry had been planned by the 3 men who had gone off toward the depot. The black-clad man was certain their mission was an evil one, and he was equally certain, from scraps of talk he had overheard, that the move had been directed against the railroad. Had the toughs engineered another wreck, or were they intent on stirring up more discontent among the construction crews? The Masked Rider could find no answer to his own questions, but he knew he would know no peace until he had ridden to Silverbow to find out what, if anything, had occurred. Seated on midnight, his muscular hands gripping the reins and his head bowed against the constant sweep of wind and snow, he swung toward Graham, carefully watching him. "Promise me one thing, Graham," he urged. "Give me your word you'll make no move against the railroad until I can round up sure proof of my claim that Wyoming and Western ain't been raiding your cattle." "I make no promises," retorted Graham. His seam features were harsh, his air intolerant. "And I'll handle things in my own time and my own way." With that grim answer, the cattleman signaled to his riders, and they pounded out of the yard. Blue Hawk turned in the saddle once, to nod significantly to the masked rider, showing by that gesture that he would keep in touch with the black-clad man. Then the masked rider sent Midnight surging forward, pointing him toward the trail that would take him to Silverbow. Once out of the yard, he found himself bucking drifts in which the stallion plunged chest deep. It was slow, laborious work. Several times, Midnight floundered on slippery rocks and into slippery depressions hidden beneath that widening white blanket. A frigid north wind howled through the trees, and the snow-laden branches dropped a steady shower of flakes upon horse and rider as they plowed through the timber. The masked rider was one dark, animate object in an endless sea of white. Except for the creak of saddle leather and the wail of the wind, a vast silence pervaded this rugged land. The cold reached through the masked rider's heavy coat and probed at his vitals with ice-rimmed, greedy fingers. Wet snow clung to his eyes and face. It drifted inside his collar and froze there. The sky was a mealy expanse of gray, and the distant tangle of bluffs and chimneys were lost in a fog of down-drifting snow that shut them from his view as if a thick, milky curtain had dropped in front of him. Chapter 12. Trapped by fire. Midnight as midnight was, the stallion was laboring from his efforts when the indistinct bulk of warehouses beside the depot in Silverbow showed up through the smother of snow. The masked rider circled around the great dumps of ties and rails, ducking behind a string of empties on a siding, and halted to study the change that had come over the boomtown. The street was a mass of darkly churned snow that ran between rising walls of white. Here and there, an alley cut through the drifts and led to some tent or frame shack that was still standing. The Empire remained. The masked rider had heard in Beaver Wells that Brader was leaving the Empire because he was constructing a more elaborate dance hall and saloon in the new boomtown. Instead of the surging, turbulent thousands that had once roamed Silverbow's streets and alleys, now only a few hundred paddies were left. About 200 were swarming back and forth in the railroad yards, loading up material trains, attacking the dumps of ties, rails, and spikes. Wyoming and Western was making a desperate attempt to move all equipment and rolling stock ahead to end of track and out of the long cut through the hills to Harlow Creek before the blizzard covered the tracks in 20 or 30-foot drifts, bottling up supply trains. A single locomotive with a snowplow attached went clattering up the line, snow spraying out on both sides of the engine cab. But the masked rider's attention was jerked abruptly away from that scene by a prolonged roar of sound in front of the railroad office. 100 brawny construction workers milled about, shouting and yelling. Then Big Pat Callahan shouted down the crowd. "The cowmen have Colonel Darwin," Callahan boomed. "Jim Brown just told me. I say we go after the colonel and wipe out Graham and his farmers for good. We'll teach 'em not to meddle with the railroad. Grab your crowbars and mauls, buckos, and round up every horse and mule you can find. We'll meet at the depot." Shock brought the masked rider up sharp. Darwin kidnapped. It couldn't be possible. But again the black-clad man remembered those 3 toughs who had gone toward the depot. They had been on their way to waylay Darwin. Graham wasn't behind it. The masked rider was sure of that. Why had the division superintendent told the paddies Graham was responsible? The masked man knew he must see Brown and find out. Somehow the masked rider was certain that Brader had had a hand in Darwin's disappearance. He had to convince Brown of that and stop the Patties from going out after revenge. If the cowmen and railroaders met, there would be slaughter, not to mention the toll-in laborers, most of them poor riders, who would get lost in the high drifts or be thrown from bucking mounts and doomed to a slow freezing death in the storm. Detouring in a wide circle around the town, the masked rider came up behind the railroad office and left midnight in the lee of another ramshackle barn. He went up the rickety stairs and, with both guns jutting from his fists, kicked the door open and leapt inside. Callahan had returned and was talking to Jim Brown, whose eyes were bloodshot and whose leathery face was drawn with strain. Both men whirled at his entrance. "Hold it," cautioned the masked rider. "I come as a friend. I just heard about Darwin. Is it true he's been kidnapped?" "Where have you been?" demanded Brown. "I figured I'd be seeing or hearing of you." "Never mind that. Answer me." "Yeah, he's gone," snapped Brown, his mouth a grim, thin slash in his weathered face. "Since early last night. Didn't want to say anything until I was sure he was in trouble. Graham's waddies kidnapped him." The masked rider's eyes were bright and sharp behind his mask. "How do you know?" "I was out scouring the town about an hour ago. When I got back, I found this note." He handed it to the masked rider. "It's a ransom note, and Graham's name is signed to it. They're asking $50,000 for his safe return, which is also supposed to be an indemnity for the cattle he claims the railroad stole from him. The low-down skunk knows we can't afford to lose Darwin. He's the guiding force behind Wyoming and Western. If anything happens to Darwin, the road'll collapse and our investors'll back out. I aim to get Darwin back if I have to destroy the Flying G." Brown's rage was terrible. It mottled his cheeks with purple, and his big hands kept knotting into huge fists. "It's a trick," said the masked rider. "Graham had nothing to do with that, and I can prove it." "How?" snapped Brown, swift interest lighting up his eyes. Then the light died out, and the corners of his mouth turned downward skeptically. "I was with the Flying G all last night and this morning," declared the masked man. "They haven't got Darwin. I can swear to that. Graham has been too busy fighting a bunch of masked raiders who stole 200 head of cattle to kidnap anybody." Tracy led the raiders. "The whole thing was work to make Graham think the railroad was responsible. Graham thinks so, because in the midst of it, Tracy bawled out your name, Brown, to hightail. And this kidnapping is another deliberate trick to get the railroaders and cattlemen warring against each other, delaying construction. I tell ya, Brader and Colorado Central are behind all your trouble." In clipped words and as briefly as possible, the masked rider recounted to Brown all that happened. The division superintendent looked bewildered. A harried expression twisted his face, and he bit his lips in indecision. "I can't hardly believe it," he murmured, "but I ain't got any reason to think you're lying. You helped the railroad at Solo Canyon, and everything I've ever heard about, you makes me think you're a square shooter, even if some folks do call you an outlaw. I reckon it could be Brader and that Colorado Central crowd. I made a mistake in not busting Brader from the start before he got so strong and lined up all the toughs on his side." He paused and looked closely at the masked rider. "You've been in hiding since that wreck," he said. "Why?" "Not hiding." The masked rider shook his head. "Just getting information here and there to find out what's behind the railroad's trouble. I owe a lot of my information to Wayne Morgan." "Morgan!" exclaimed Brown. "I've been looking for him." "Wyoming and Western gave him a raw deal, Brown. Brown nodded dismally. What had happened to Morgan was an unpleasant memory to him. I know that, he confessed. Colonel Darwin was dead set against him, though. We'd found out he had put his own name on the letter Darwin had written for the troubleshooter who has killed in the wreck. It looked suspicious, but when we learned about what he did at end of track when he broke up the strike, I was sure he was on the level and just wanted the job, like he said. But where is he? By this time, he's well on the way to Frisco. He was pretty much disgusted. I'd met him once before, several years ago, in Texas. A lone wolf and plenty tough, but square. Ran across him by accident in the hills above the Flying G spread. Seems we was both hunting evidence. Only he didn't like the deal that had been handed to him, and said he just about decided to take an offer to help patrol the right-of-way for a new railroad building along the California coast. The masked rider broke off as the sound of hundreds of men shouting and yelling at the depot came on the wings of the wind. It beat against the frail walls of the office like hammer strokes. Brown, the masked man said grimly, you've got to stop them Patties from riding to the Flying G. It'll be a bloody carnage. Besides, half of your fellers can't ride, and they'll be thrown shore as shootin'. All right, but what about Darwin? Asked Brown. If Brader's got him, where do you think he is? The masked rider considered a brief moment. We'll try the Empire. If he's not there, we'll have to look for him in Beaver Wells. I figure they'll hang on to him until they get the money, then kill him, because that'll hurt the railroad. More'n any wreck or strike could hurt it. Come on, shouted Brown, and leapt to a peg on the wall where a gun and cartridge belt hung. He strapped it around his heavy coat. All three men went rushing out into the storm. At the foot of the stairway, one look toward the depot told them they were too late. Fully 100 men mounted on mules and horses had gone off into the timber, intent on wreaking revenge on the Flying G. Callahan groaned. We'll foller 'em later, said the masked rider. Let's head for the Empire. A crackling roar and a mushrooming pall of black smoke greeted them as they raced toward Brader's dance hall. The Empire was ablaze. Fire was licking along the walls from several places at once. As the masked rider, Brown and Callahan went floundering through the knee-deep snow, suddenly 4 heavily bundled figures lurched out of an alley beside the Empire. When they sighted the oncoming men, guns snapped into their hands and ruddy muzzle flares began to stab through the murk. The masked rider spotted Bill Tracy at the head of the group. The black-clad man's gun swept up and red flames spurted from the long barrels. Tracy kept running, but his legs were pumping ineffectively against his weakening muscles. The spread fingers of his left hand went to his side, and a trickle of crimson seeped through. He fell on his face, and a strangling cough racked his lungs. The bearded man behind Tracy vaulted the prone body of the Colorado Central troubleshooter and ripped 2 quick shots at the masked rider. The black-clad man was weaving and dodging, his muscular body held in a crouch, the guns in his fists spitting viciously. 2 of his bullets sped for the man's chest. The bearded fellow twisted and spun into a hip-high drift. Callahan grunted with pain as he stopped a bullet, but he plunged on. As the furious fight went on, the masked rider noted vaguely that Brown and Callahan were still beside him. Then he saw that all Tracy's gunmen were down, their blood staining the snow. "You going inside that furnace?" demanded Brown breathlessly. "Yeah," said the masked rider. "I've got an idea Darwin's in there. That's why they set the place on fire." Through the white spray of snow billowed great surging flowers of flame. Heat struck at them solidly as they reached the saloon entrance, and the hungry roar of the blaze was a challenging sound. But the masked rider did not hesitate. Lowering his head and shielding his eyes, he bolted through the V-shaped opening of the clapboard saloon. Callahan and Brown followed at his heels. It was like stepping inside a blast furnace. The fire was devouring the dry, frail wood in a relentless fury. Great runnels of scarlet flame rippled along the splintering boards. Cinders and smoke starred the eerie, crimson-dappled interior. Through heat-seared eyes, they stared about the room, at the fire eating into the bar, leaping to the gaming tables. Boards splintered and cracked, and a cloud of flying sparks speared past them. Coughing and gasping for breath, the masked rider lurched to Jess Brader's office. He kicked the door open, pushed inside, with Brown and Callahan behind him. The room was empty, and already this new draft was setting up a terrific roaring behind them. Smoke, dark and thick and acrid, swirled around them, wrapping greedy fingers around Brader's desk and chair. The masked rider stumbled over a rug. The rug shifted, revealed a rectangular cutout pattern in the floor. In the middle of that rectangle was a metal ring. "A trapdoor!" he exclaimed. "Darwin's down there!" Brown yelled. The masked rider grabbed the ring and hauled up the trapdoor. The weird light of the mounting blaze behind them lit up gloomy depths. It showed a slanting stairway, a shallow room, and a man bound and gagged, lying on a dirty blanket. The man was Colonel Darwin. Brown and the masked rider leaped into the black hole. Fingers fumbling awkwardly in their haste, they freed Darwin's bonds, ripped the gag from his mouth. Darwin mumbled something, and his squinting eyes fixed worriedly on the masked man. "Yeah, he's the masked rider," Brown said hastily. "But if it hadn't been for him, we wouldn't be here, and this'd be your funeral pyre." "Hurry!" the masked rider choked, his breath coming laboriously. "Got to get him out of here, pronto!" Chapter 13. Wrecked trestle. Colonel Darwin was stiff and weak from being tied up so long. They had to carry him up those steep, slanting stairs. Near the top, Callahan lent a hand. Then, with Callahan bringing up the rear, the masked man and Brown staggered with their burden across the long room which had become a torrid furnace. Somehow they gained the street. The swift bite of the gale, the savage lashing of the icy snow on their faces, was a welcome relief. They laid Darwin down. A fit of coughing seized the masked rider. Then, as he stared back at the Empire, cold horror hit him. "Where's Callahan?" he demanded. I don't know." Brown stared wildly in the burning piece. "I thought he was right behind us." Fearfully, both men's eyes were on the billowing black smoke, starred with curling tendrils of flame. Callahan was somewhere inside, at the mercy of the blaze. "He must have been downed by smoke," yelled the masked rider as he ran for the saloon. "Wait!" yelled Brown. "You can't go in there. It's suicide." But the masked rider didn't hear him. A crimson banner whirled past the V-notch of the saloon entrance, taunting him, daring him to brave its menace. Then a rush of wind whipped that tongue of flame backward. The masked rider saw his chance and dived through the opening. He stumbled over a loosened board, sprawled on his face. His groping fingers scraped along the floor. A splinter raked his palm, and heat swept against him. Charred boards were breaking up, dissolving into ashes. A section of the back wall caved in with a mighty whoosh of sound. A burning brand fell on his arm, singeing a wide patch of hair. He flung it away and got up, staggering farther on into the depths of that roaring red peril. There was a booming concussion, as a heavy timber plunged to the floor somewhere beyond him. Then he saw Callahan lying on his face. He was trapped beneath a heavy post which had collapsed, pinning him against the wall of Brader's office. The black-clad man crawled to the spot. Callahan was moaning, but he managed to grin as the masked rider got a grip on the timber, tried to lift it. It didn't budge. The smoke was getting thicker. It was like an acrid black fog, swathing him in its choking mists. At last, the timber began to move. Callahan shifted, his legs sliding along the floor. He tried to crawl away. The timber was ablaze at its far end, and flames were feeding along it, seeping toward them. There was a sudden crash above them. Daylight showed through the roof. Crimson-starred brands sprayed down upon them and were followed by a tangle of falling timbers. A split 2x4 cracked the masked rider behind the knees, knocking him on his face. Another timber tumbled down in a shower of spars. It glanced off his shoulder, thumped against the side of his head, ramming his chin into the hot floorboards. Blackness swirled over his consciousness. Grimly, desperately, he fought it. There was a dull roaring in his ears. His smoke-seared eyes could see nothing but a leaping sea of fire. He strained and twisted, trying to free himself of the tremendous weight which crushed him to the floor, but could not move it. He was trapped. He knew that when the timbers above him did not move, the weight pressed painfully and steadily into his back. His palms were spread out before him. Fascinated with horror, he watched rivers of fire race toward him along the floor. Boards were sucked up by the blaze, and the flames marched on. It became hard for him to breathe, for the heat was a dry, searing torture, racking his lungs. Clouds of smoke lit up with pulsing tongues of red enveloped him. Death was seeking him out with a hot, insistent hand. Then, out of the blinding nightmare, shot through with taunting spurts of flame, hideous sprays of sparks, falling brands, waves of choking black smoke, came a steady, urgent call. The masked rider hadn't realized that he had been drifting off into the deep, dark pit of oblivion. Awareness returned to him in slow, agonizing waves. Awareness that brought a renewal of pain and hopelessness. But there was the call again. "Senor! Senor!" Then he saw Blue Hawk. It brought no wonder to him that the Yaqui was here. It was enough that Blue Hawk was beside him, crouching in the sweeping rush of flames and smoke. Strength and hope returned. The masked rider began to renew his struggles to get free. Dimly, he saw another broad-shouldered shape, outlined by the red of flames, and recognized Brown. And he caught a glimpse of Callahan, also pinned down and helpless. Now Blue Hawk and Brown tugged at the timbers which imprisoned him and Callahan. One came loose and was tossed aside. Then another was lifted away. Strong arms gripped the masked rider under the armpits, hauled him to his feet. "All right, Hawk," he said huskily. He lurched unsteadily, but he was able to stand. The Yaqui watched him until satisfied he would not fall, then helped free Callahan. The railroad foreman had a broken leg and had to be carried. And as all of them fought their way across the blazing room to the masked rider, it seemed that the saloon entrance was barred by a high red wall that was alive and evil, standing there to hold them back. The saloon was little more than a hollow shell now. All the walls would collapse at any moment. The entire floor was burning. Flames licked at their clothing. But somehow they fought their way to the entrance, and in one brief moment, when a gust of wind whipped a narrow, clear passage through that barrier of fire, they plunged through. Out into the blizzard, they staggered on into the cold drifts. The flames on their clothing hissed out. They rolled in the snow, reveling in the cold. Construction workers had come rushing up to watch the destruction of the building, not knowing that men inside it were fighting for their lives. Now they lent helping hands. Someone produced whiskey, and it was passed around. After 10 minutes, the masked rider could stand without swaying. He had no broken bones, but his back ached from the pressure of the 2x4, and his eyes were bloodshot from smoke. He glanced at Blue Hawk, and in that one look were his fervent thanks, gratitude that did not need to be put into words. "Where did you come from, Hawk?" he asked. "Senor, we've got to hurry," urged Blue Hawk. "Graham has sent a crew up to Harlow Creek to dynamite the trestle." That announcement brought an infuriated shout from Colonel Darwin. "That's what Brader's bunch are planning to do," he exclaimed, and as he shot a glance at the masked rider, there was admiration and respect in it. "They're out in the open now. Brader is taking orders from John Winston of Colorado Central. I heard all the deviltry they were planning, for they never intended to let me live. Just until they got the ransom money. Masked Rider, when you helped bust up that raid at the Flying G last night, even though they nabbed Graham's cattle, they got scared. They were afraid you were getting onto their game, so they figured on burning down the empire with me in it, so there'd be no evidence to convict them of having had any part in my disappearance. With me gone, they counted on Wyoming and Western going busted." "As it would," growled Brown. The masked rider moved over to Bill Tracy, who was being forced to stand by 3 grim-eyed Paddies. Tracy was weak, for he had lost considerable blood. There was abject fear in his eyes. "Tracy, you're going to spill all you know, and back up everything Darwin has said here," the masked rider grimly announced. "I figured, and Brader was working for Colorado Central to bust Wyoming and Western. You and your toughs caused those supply train wrecks and raided Graham's beef, right?" Yeah, gasped Tracy feebly, "but don't let these Paddies get me." "You should have thought of that before you dynamited Solo Canyon and killed them Gandy dancers," snapped the masked rider, cold steel in his eyes and in his voice. He swung on Darwin and Brown. "We've got to move, if it ain't too late. We've got to head off the Paddies before they tangle with Graham's punchers. And we've got to stop his punchers from blowing up the trestle," Brown said grimly. "You'll never have a chance," broke in Tracy. "Brader's toughs are already up at Harlow Creek, setting a charge. You'll be too late." Brown cursed, moved toward Tracy as if he meant to strangle the remaining strength out of him. Colonel Darwin looked haggard and beaten. "We'll do what we can," declared the masked rider, and the very tone of his voice, his personality, seemed to give these men some hope. "I saw a couple of locomotives in the yard. Hook one up to some flats in a boxcar. We'll load our horses in the boxcar, let the Paddies ride the flats and ride out to the trestle." He swung his attention directly to Brown's and Darwin. "Brown, you go with the men, but Colonel Darwin, Blue Hawk, and I can get off the train 5 miles west of Silverbow. That'll put us somewheres between Flying G headquarters and the Yellow Ridges, where Graham went early this morning. He should be hazing his beef down through the lower meadows by this time. Meanwhile, the Paddies can ride out to the trestle with Brown and stop that blast, if there's time." Grimly, the masked man recognized the tragedy that was facing these railroad men who had survived all the hard rigors of long months of hewing a path for the steel out of the wilderness. And now a blizzard and a dynamite blast threatened new disaster. With the masked rider leading them, the entire mob stumbled through the snow to the depot. Eager construction workers, wallowing in drifts, leaping over rails, swarmed through the yard. While Callahan was carried inside the boarding train and someone put a big pot of coffee on to boil, the track crew hooked up a train, and a fireman began stoking a fire in the firebox to build up steam pressure. Several cups of steaming coffee served to send warmth and renewed vigor through the masked rider's bone-weary body. Then he was out in the yards again, leading Midnight into a boxcar. 200 Gandhi dancers leapt aboard the flats. A huge plow had been attached to the front of the engine, and with a brawny Irishman at the throttle, the train clattered off the siding onto the main line and lurched up the grade toward Harlow Creek Trestle. It had stopped snowing now, but there was the threat of more snow in the drab gray sky and in the raw edge of the gale. The big plow hooked to the front of the engine bit into the drifts. Snow sprayed past the train in billowing clouds. Drive wheels spun on the icy rails, and steam jetted from every pounding cylinder as the train labored up the grade. 5 miles out of Silver Bell, the line of cars jolted to a halt. The masked rider, Blue Hawk, and Colonel Darwin took their horses, mounted, and set off through unmarred banks of snow, angling for a narrow trail that wandered through a thin stand of timber. They kept their heads bowed while the wind wailed its frigid song around them. 1/2 mile they covered at a slow, laboring pace. Then they heard a distant shout, the faint bawling of cattle, the flat report of a gun. Darwin flashed the masked rider a grim look. They pushed their mounts harder. As they broke suddenly out of the timber, ahead of them they caught a brief glimpse of a straggling line of cattle coming down through a cut in 2 brush-clad hills. Riders were deploying away from those cows, spurring toward another bunch of men, galloping awkwardly toward them. Abruptly, a far-off, rumbling concussion of sound slammed its booming racket against the savage, clarion call of the wind. That duller roar ran on and on for 10 or 15 seconds before its echoes were absorbed by the blizzard. "There goes the trestle," grated Darwin. "And there are the Paddies and the ranchmen," said the masked rider. "At least we're in time to keep 'em from killing each other." Chapter 14. Ride Through Peril. Houts and yells broke from the awkwardly mounted Gandhi dancers. The few who were armed with guns fired wildly, their bullets speeding harmlessly past the punchers. "Tear them cowmen apart, buckos," some spiker roared. "We'll clean up the woods with them and get Darwin back." Although so tremendously outnumbered, the grim-lipped Flying G Waddies came plunging on. Their guns swept out and began to flash redly through the storm. 2 spikers spilled from their mounts into a drift. Then, suddenly, knots of men were locked in fierce hand-to-hand encounter. Into that seething tangle rode the masked rider and Wyoming and Western's chief engineer. "Hold it, you Paddies and cowmen," bellowed the black-clad man. "There's no need to fight." "Stand back, masked rider," growled a brawny gauger. "We're finding out where Darwin is and getting him back." "Darwin is here with me," yelled the masked rider. Grimly, he spurred Midnight right into a big tangle of wrestling shapes. The stallion's powerful shoulders knocked men to right and left. They floundered in the snow, cursing and growling. The masked avenger clubbed one man into submission with a blow from his Colt barrel. Then, several Paddies were shouting, "It is the Colonel, buckos!" As suddenly as the battle had begun, it halted. Punchers holstered their guns. Railroad workers dropped crowbars and mauls. "I'm mighty glad we were in time," Darwin said fervently. "This might have been a slaughter." He looked at Ed Graham. Graham, with the aid of the masked rider, I was rescued from the Empire, where I'd been taken by Brader's toughs and left to burn to death when they set the place on fire. They kidnapped me and left a note with Brown signed with your name. It was those toughs, working with John Winston of Colorado Central, who caused the wrecks of our supply trains and who stole your beef. Graham looked from Darwin to the masked rider, then to Bill Tracy who, pale and rigid with cold, could barely sit his saddle. The bullet wound in his side and the grueling punishment of the ride had taken severe toll. "Talk, Tracy," snapped the masked rider, "if you want to save your miserable neck. Tell Graham it's all true." "Darwin's right," Tracy blurred hoarsely. Abject terror twisted his thin face. "Brader and Winston are the men you want." A swift change came over the big cowman's features, and his voice was troubled. "If I'd only known in time," he moaned. "We've all been fools. I sent a bunch of men up to the creek to blast the trestle. You heard that blast a few minutes ago? That was the bridge going. Reckon it's too late to say I'm sorry, as blazes." He was interrupted by the appearance of 4 riders, plowing through the snow from a side trail. They approached warily, then came on more rapidly as Graham beckoned. "You dynamited the trestle?" Graham demanded drearily. "No," was the prompt, angry reply. "Some jaspers beat us to it. We was late getting started and lost a lot of time when my hoss threw a shoe and went lame. It was just as we topped the first high ridge and saw the trestle that the bridge blew up. Thought we saw some men right off on the far side of the creek, but we couldn't be sure." "Brader's toughs blasted the bridge," said Tracy. "That'll delay us for days in this weather," Darwin said savagely. "Every supply train from Kansas City will be held up until the bridge gang can make repairs. What's more, we may be trapped this side of the divide if the snow doesn't let up." "Wait," said the masked rider eagerly, but none of them could guess how impatient he was to face Brader and Winston and finish this business, which threatened to ruin Wyoming and Western. "Maybe we can make temporary repairs and run a train to Beaver Wells and clean out every tough at end of track." Roars of approval greeted that suggestion. Some of the defeated expression left Darwin's face. His eyes began to show hope. "It's worth a chance," he said. "And it's a chance for everybody to throw his fists and guns into a fight to clean the hard cases out of this area," added the masked rider grimly. "We've got more'n 300 patties here. If we go back to the tracks, I figure Brown ought to be bringing the special back this way. We can return to Silverbow, load up with rails, ties, and lumber, and repair the trestle." He paused to fling a deliberate, hard stare at Graham and the punchers lined up behind him. "How do you figure in this, Graham?" he demanded. "You've lost plenty of beef to the toughs. Here's your chance to square accounts. If you help the railroad now, you'll be helping yourself in the long run." "Masked rider," replied Graham quickly. "I'm with you." The huge cavalcade swung about then and headed back toward the railroad cut. Graham paused only long enough to delegate a crew of 5 men to haze the beef herd back to the ranch. Then they were pushing through the timber, over a trail already broken by the masked rider and Colonel Darwin. It began snowing again, and the wind lifted, shouldering through the trees unceasingly, savagely. A smother of flakes swirled about them, completely blanketing this land. And in all the high passes and the deep railroad cuts, the drifts grew deeper and deeper. The piercing wail of the locomotive whistle came down the grade to them as they reached the right-of-way. In 10 minutes, the flat swung into view around a bend, jolting over the rail sections. Brake shoes squealed, and the train halted. Jim Brown leaped out of the engine cab with the dire news that the trestle had been dynamited and that he hadn't arrived in time even to see any signs of the men who had been responsible. "How bad is it?" the masked rider demanded. Brown shook his head. His face was worried. "Big section this side of the creek is ruined. Tracks ripped up, tossed into the gorge, and the superstructure messed up. Think the crew we have with us could repair it well enough to put a train across it before night?" the masked rider asked. "Don't forget, we've got Bachelor and some of his bridge gang with us." "I doubt it," Brown said dismally, "especially in this storm." "I still think it's worth a try," said the masked rider. He looked at Darwin, who nodded vigorously. Accordingly, the black-clad man, Darwin, Blue Hawk, and Tracy led their horses to the boxcar to go back with the train to Silverbow with the Paddies, who piled into the flat car. The rest agreed to wait in the bitter drive of the wind and snow for the train's return. They backed down the westbound track at high speed, bell clanging loudly and the whistle echoing eerily through the canyons. In Silverbow, it took 40 minutes to hook up a string of gondolas and additional flats. They loaded rails and ties and hundreds of feet of board lumber for the trestle. Then, with the masked rider and a brawny Irishman alternately bailing coal into the firebox to maintain a high steam pressure, Brown sent the train rocketing around curves, slamming ponderously up the grades to where Graham and the others waited. They made just a brief stop to pick up the cowmen and the few laborers with them, then rolled on to the trestle. High on the windswept tableland, with the turbulent roar of the creek in the rocky gorge a thunder in their ears, they came to the scene of the wreck. The masked rider's first view of it was disheartening. Torn and splintered timbers pointed in all directions. A section of rail hung over the gorge, twisted and bent in the shape of a horseshoe. There were great dark gaps in the spider-like webbing of the wooden supports which extended tier on tier into the canyon. Bachelor, foreman of the bridge gang, led the eager Paddies from the train and attacked the seemingly hopeless task of repairing the span before darkness set in. First came the laborious job of unloading all the equipment and tools. But the hundreds of hands that labored unceasingly finished that chore rapidly. Then workers began to swarm over the webbing with hammers and saws and nails. The snow drifted down in an ever-thickening curtain, and the gorge was lost in a white haze. Hands grew stiff and numb with cold. The wind buffeted the workers, laced sharply through their heavy clothing, strove to loose them from their precarious holds on crosspieces. Inexperienced as they were, the masked rider and Blue Hawk found themselves climbing through the interlaced webbing of broken, disjointed timbers. Great 2x4s and other larger, stronger sections of boards were passed to the black-clad man. He helped set them in place. His arm drove up and down in an endless rhythm, punching spikes into place. Once he lost his grip on a crosspiece and fell several feet, bumping and jolting against hard-edged boards. Finally, his groping hands found a purchase on a strong 2x4, and he held on until Bachelor and another man came to his aid. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours passed. Still the storm raged, and the snow grew deeper in the canyon, piled higher along the tracks. The men labored on, racing against time, buoyed by the urgency of this job that had to be done, and a grimmer job which lay ahead, one of revenge and retribution. At last, the supporting sections of interlaced timbers had been sufficiently repaired to risk laying down new ties and bolting new rails into place. The Paddies swarmed back to the canyon rim. Darwin and Brown and the masked rider surveyed the hasty repair job. In each man's eyes could be seen the same gray doubt and the same reckless resolve to take the great risk of running a train across the gorge. "All right, buccos," announced Darwin. "We'll take a chance. Any of you who don't want to tag along can stay back here." Wide grins greeted his remark. Then every worker was racing toward the flats to find a place for himself. The masked rider, Blue Hawk, Darwin, and Brown piled into the engine cab. Coal was heaped on the fire. Steam rose in the gauge. Brown grabbed the Johnson bar, sent the train backing down the line for almost a mile. Then he looked once at the others, slammed on the brakes. His hand reached for the throttle, moved it forward. The train lurched. Couplings jolted thunderously. Ponderous drive wheels churned over the slippery rails. The train gained speed rapidly. The rail clicks merged into a continuous rattle. Ruddy flame and smoke bloomed from the wide stack. The sound of the exhaust was a roaring sound that challenged the wild wailing of the wind. Chapter 15. Finish fight. Every face in the engine cab was grim and bleak. The same unanswerable question was throbbing through each mind. Would the trestle hold the train? Or would it collapse, sending engine, cars, and men plummeting to destruction in the rocky abyss of Harrow Canyon? The train crested the grade, shot across the flat rim, and came on the bridge approach. Brown and the masked rider craned their heads out of the cab window, careless of the icy lash of wind. Their eyes were riveted upon the twin lines of steel that spanned the shaky, half-repaired, spider-like webbing of the trestle. Brown's hand moved the throttle to the last notch. The train lurched forward, the steel plates on the boiler head creaking and groaning. Then they were out upon the trestle, high above the gorge. The train was like a leaping steel monster, bouncing over the shaky, uneven roadbed. The masked rider felt a sickening lurch of his stomach when the timbers beneath the locomotive sagged. Somewhere, there was a slowly splintering crash of sound. They were hitting close to 50 miles an hour as they sped across the trestle. Brown decided to keep the throttle full ahead and take the curve on the far side of the creek without throwing on the brakes. They hit the bend, sped past bleak, bare ridges as the wheels screeched around the curve, trucks jolting and rattling. The masked rider peered backward. He saw the last of the flat cars, loaded with workers, bounce and careen over a sagging section of the bridge. Then he saw timbers buckle and sag, saw a section of rail rear skyward, split away from the adjoining rail, and plunge into the canyon. Other timbers split and broke, and fully 1/4 of the bridge began to disintegrate. But that last flat stayed on the rails, was dragged around the bend. Then the train was racing on toward Beaver Wells. "We made it!" The masked rider's grin was tight with the strain that had gripped him. It was close. The same strain was in Darwin's face and husky voice. Big Jim Brown turned from the boiler head. His heavy shoulders straightened, and his jaw was belligerent. "I'm looking forward to the fight ahead," he said. "So am I." The masked rider immediately began checking his guns. On and on they rolled through the storm, with the light fading rapidly from a dull gray sky. At last, the dark blur of buildings that were Beaver Wells came into view. They thundered on. Brown closed the throttle, grabbed the air brake lever. Wheel brakes locked along the straining line of cars, and the train jolted to a halt, 30 feet from end of track. With wild roars, the paddies jumped from the cars, started rushing toward Main Street. Other workers milled back and forth in the snow that clogged the alleys. Some were turning towards the train, rushing forward to meet the new arrivals. The Masked Rider and Blue Hawk climbed down from the cab. They saw a locomotive, steam billowing from exhaust valves on the eastbound track. There was no hogger in sight, but they gave it only a passing glance, then were running forward with the patties. In Main Street, yelling of the Gandhi dancers shook the air of the late afternoon. Ahead loomed the big wooden shack, which was Brader's new saloon and dance hall. They swept on toward it, and in moments more, Bedlam ruled in Beaver Wells. With crowbars, picks, and axes, the patties struck the empire. A big bunch of them raced inside. Others began beating and hammering at the walls, tearing at the boards with crowbars and axes. Saloon toughs mingled with the patties. Hand-to-hand fighting went on inside and outside of the dance hall. Half a dozen gunmen stormed out of an alley, red flames spurting from their guns. The Masked Rider knocked over a big bearded man with a sweeping blow of his fist. Then he ducked into the alley, and his flaming Colt dropped one gunman in his tracks, sent another skidding face down in the snow. Suddenly, a door far down along the building was opened, and two men rushed out. One was tall and slender, wearing a black hat and gambler's coat. The other man was paunchy and heavy. With a surge of anger, the Masked Rider recognized Jess Brader and John Winston. He had left Blue Hawk and the other Wyoming and Western men in Main Street, fighting. But alone he went slogging through the snow after the dark, fleeing shapes in this back street. They went past one intersection, then ducked into an alley. It was not until they came out into the open beyond town that they became conscious of pursuit. Brader, turning to glance back, saw the Masked Rider and fired 3 shots at his weaving target without any effect. They were heading for the railroad tracks. Suddenly, the Masked Rider realized why that locomotive had been waiting on the eastbound rails. Brader and Winston had been prepared for emergencies and meant to leave their hirelings to face the fury of the mob while they fled. Brader and Winston reached end of track, climbed up into the engine cab. Breath was tearing at the black-clad man's lungs as he sought to increase his pace. His right foot plunged into an unseen hole, and he fell into a drift. But he was up instantly, blowing through the snow that plastered his face and mask. Steam was jetting from the engine's exhaust valves. The huge drivers began to rotate, and the locomotive chuffed forward as the Masked Rider hit the edge of tracks. The engine was drawing away from him. His boots pounded over the ties. Winston appeared above him, swaying in the shifting coal pile of the tender. A gun lifted in his fist. The Masked Rider dug in his heels and raced on. A bullet clanged off a rail beside him. Then he reached out, got a hold on the railing of the steel ladder that led up the rear of the tender. He pulled himself upward. Ties blurred dizzily beneath him as the locomotive gathered speed. The exhaust was a bellowing roar in his ears. Winston scrambled closer. A hunk of coal flew past the Masked Rider's face. It was followed by a blast of hot lead. Hanging to the railing, he drew his Colt, made Winston draw back with a flashing shot. Holstering his gun, he clambered to the top of the tender, balancing his body to the swaying of the locomotive. The click of rail joints was a humming rattle in his ears as he came up with an unexpected rush, jumped into the piled coal. His right foot went out from under him, and he fell. Winston, his lips bared in a snarl, but with fear graying his flabby jowls, fired again and missed. He was earing back the hammer for another shot when the Masked Rider struggled to his knees and drove a bullet into him. Winston jerked. Horror turned him rigid. Then he lurched forward, and as he fell, his gun went off. A hot sliver of pain shot through the masked rider's left arm. Numbness crept along the muscles, and blood began to seep out of a wound above the elbow. He dropped his left-hand gun, but promptly lifted his other Colt and pinned his sights on Winston, who was getting up again. The gun crashed. The bullet cut all support away from Winston's right leg, and he plunged face down in the coal. The masked rider left him there and stumbled toward the engine cab. Jess Brader was at the throttle, driving for every bit of speed in the protesting high-wheeler. He spun around and saw the masked rider. A gun flicked into his hand. The masked rider fired first, but his feet were already slipping out from under him in the treacherous mountain of coal. A wild bullet ricocheted off the boiler head. Amid a dark shower of coal, the masked rider half fell, half leaped into the cab. Brader tried to twist aside, but the masked rider's full weight caught him, impelled him backward. Long arms wrapped around Brader, pinned him unmercifully as the two men crashed to the cab floor. The shock of that fall drove the wind out of Brader. For a moment, he lay still, and the masked rider slugged him with his gun barrel. A lurch of the locomotive rolled the masked rider to the side. Brader, wiry and still dangerous, scrambled around, kicked the masked avenger in the ribs. The masked rider's right arm swung, clubbing the gun, but his blow at Brader's head missed. Another kick in the ribs, the smash of an arm against his wrist, made him drop his remaining gun. Then both were on their feet, slugging it out, fists hammering flesh and bone. The masked rider couldn't lift his left arm, but he drove in hard, hooked his right to the jaw, brought a savage uppercut to Brader's jaw that sent the gambler spinning against the boiler head. A glazed look spread over Brader's face. In desperation, he grabbed for a big iron wrench, but he never got a chance to wield it, for the masked rider charged him. A shoulder drove Brader's back against sharp-edged gauges, and a looping fist smashed home on the angle of his jaw under the ear and dropped him, unconscious, to the steel-plated underpinning, exhausted from his harrowing labors. While the pain in his left arm prodded him, the masked rider whirled to the cab window. The damaged Harlow Creek trestle was rushing up to meet him. He dived toward the air brake. One swift move closed the throttle and shut off the steam. Then he threw on the brakes, fighting the momentum of the engine with air and sand from the boiler dome. Skidding along the slippery rails, wheels spinning, then locking as the sand took hold, the high-wheeler finally slid to a halt 40 feet short of the trestle. Although the masked rider's fatigued body was crying for rest, he was anxious to return to Beaver Wells. Accordingly, he grabbed the Johnson bar and shoved the locomotive into reverse. When he got back to end of track, there was a seething mob of men waiting for him. Right in front were Colonel Darwin, Jim Brown, and Blue Hawk. Many, including Darwin himself, were bloody and disheveled from fighting, but triumph gleamed in their eyes. The masked rider climbed wearily down from the engine cab, swaying a little when he struck the snow. Beyond the crowd, the snow had been churned into a brownish mess by hundreds of sliding boots. Brader's pretentious new saloon had been torn down. It was now just a tangle of boards and twisted joints, in the midst of which lay the ruins of a portable bar, a piano, and 50 broken tables. "Where did you go, masked rider?" demanded Darwin. The black-clad man gestured to the tender and the cab. "I spotted Brader and Winston trying to light a shuck out of Beaver Wells. I followed 'em and brought 'em back." "Both of them?" "Yeah," Darwin grinned. All of the spikers and graders and track layers were grinning. The love of a fight showed in their faces, and the admiration for a man who was tough and hard and courageous like themselves bannered from their shining eyes. "You're all man," murmured Darwin. "I'm glad you cornered Winston. Is he dead?" When the black-clad man shook his head, Darwin resumed. "Well, in that case, I'll turn him over to the government. We'll let President Grant handle him. I reckon Winston's stock will be confiscated, and maybe a penalty will be imposed on Colorado Central. At any rate, I think you've helped to give us a clear track from here to Salt Lake. I'm no longer afraid of not beating Colorado Central. Winston's crooked dealings will ruin him. Let it snow all week. I don't give a hoot. When it stops, we'll get the plows out, open up the track, and get those supply trains running again. And we'll rebuild the trestle. Wyoming and Western is still laying steel." "You bet it is, Colonel," Jim Brown said fervently. "And with your permission, I'd like to offer the masked rider a job with us, if he wants it." "He can have it," said Darwin eagerly. He flashed a rueful smile. "I had Wayne Morgan tagged wrong at first, and I reckon I did the same with you. I wouldn't believe Brown when he said the masked rider was square and honest. I don't care if you are an outlaw. We need a troubleshooter, and the job is yours at $300 a month. And I don't care about the mask you wear either. You can leave it on or off as you please. Not that I wouldn't like to see beneath it." The masked rider grinned, in spite of his pain, but Blue Hawk recognized that there was pain and saw dried blood on the back of the big man's hand. "Senor is hurt." "Just the arm, Hawk. It's all right." He looked at Darwin. "Thanks for your offer, but Hawk and me are headed for California just as soon as this storm lets up. But right now, if there's a Sawbones around—" Sure, said Jim Brown. "Over in the boarding train. The railroad dock will fix that arm." The masked rider stumbled off through the snow with Blue Hawk at his side, and the crowd of grinning workers broke ranks, made a path for him to pass. Their triumphant singing lifted to the wintry sky as they followed those two stalwart riders of the danger trails. Further exploits of the masked rider in Dead Man's Ranch. By Larry A. Harris, next issue's exciting full-length novel. Don't be cheeky, mister. Why not? I shave with star blades.